Every season there's always a bit of chaos that goes on inside of a division. Many dynasties form, rivalries take shape, upsets come out of nowhere, and pretty much anything else that you could imagine happens. But what would happen if all of those things happened multiple times in a singular season, to a singular division, involved every team in said division, and happened all at once? Because that's basically what Intermediate B was for Season 2. Out of all 3 divisions in between the 2 subdivisions for Intermediate, Inter B was quite the wild ride. That's not to say that Inter A didn't go through their own set of struggles, but we already gave them their time in the spotlight. Now it's these guys' turn. Some of the least predictable, most dominant, most toxic, and all-around most insane teams came out of this division. So it's no wonder they constantly complained about having no clue of what was going on. I'm not exactly sure how we're gonna pull it off, but it's only fair to give it a shot. So here goes nothing. Season 2, Season in Review, Inter B. Going into the draft, Intermediate B arguably had the biggest question mark surrounding it. Not a single manager had experience in their position before, and while some had taken up steam staff positions in the past, it wasn't a guarantee that they'd be ready to take on the mantle of the ultimate leader of their team. Most of them were familiar with the community, Lilithy and Nick both coming from Season 1 novice finalists Papega Parrots, Adifi coming up from playing in Season 1's Botburgers, Kurt having played in Hangzhou previously, Master Dempsey taking his second shot at managing after IRL issues prevented him from doing so in Season 1, leaving Veritas being the only newcomer to the community. Lilithy got to work by appointing most of the old Papega coaching staff as his assistants, and also managing to swipe Madam as his captain. Nick also grabbed Sebs as his captain, leaving very few old Papega players for Shash to protect going into Season 2. But he was going to rebuild Season 1 Platchat anyway, so it didn't really matter in the long run. Dempsey seemed to be using much of the core from Season 1's OTW roster, and building out from there. Having Dad as the captain already gave Powerhouse a powerful flex DPS to start, and many other players they were scouting already had pre-established synergy with each other from past teams. They'd still have to grab everyone they wanted from the draft itself, but Powerhouse looked to be confident in themselves from the get-go. Adifi, leading Wait What, started gathering a friend group of his own, though this crew was more toxic than the majority of Intermediate. With Soundwave as his captain, Adifi looked to have a pretty strong third of a starting roster already, but it was brought into question whether or not his intended lineup's mentalities would get in the way at any point in the season. Kurt established Yoink and was forced to scout quite a bit as a result of not being familiar with Intermediate's player base as much as Advanced. He seemed to go for a mix of players that were talented mechanically as well as having good personalities, and were willing to work together. Right off the bat they were predicted to be one of the top teams in the division as they had picked up a lot of extremely strong players towards the upper end of the Intermediate SR range, and they definitely seemed to have a healthy attitude about dealing with such expectations coming out of the draft. In the last few days leading up to the draft, Veritas was the only manager that had been mostly unresponsive. He had barely chosen his team's branding after being poked by staff quite a bit to get that done. And he hadn't even chosen his captain yet. Somewhat predictably, only 3 days before the draft itself, Veritas reached out to staff, stating that IRL issues prevented him from being able to manage any longer, leaving an empty spot where there should have been a team. In favor of not having only 5 teams in one of the Intermediate subdivisions, staff decided to reach out to other candidates who barely didn't make the first round of manager picks. At the time, Milky was helping Tyranitar scout for Geometric in Novice, and was suddenly presented with an impossible option. Stay in Novice as team staff and give up the opportunity to manage for another season, or take the chance and try to establish a new team with only 3 days left to scout. With immense gratitude and respect from staff, Milky took the latter option and chose to establish the team Overcharged. He didn't really have enough time to properly scout players out, so as a result he wasn't entirely confident in his drafted lineup. Overcharge was predicted to be at the bottom of the preseason power rankings, though most people understood the terrible circumstances that led to such a placing. Lilithy's Shanghai Sellouts and Adifi's Wait What were predicted to be the Intermediate frontrunners coming out of the draft. Yoink and High Society were assumed to be bringing up the middle of the pack. We already discussed how Overcharged was predicted to be at the bottom of the barrel for the time being, and predictions were seemingly all over the place for Powerhouse, some analysts placing them towards the top, while others had them closer towards the middle of the pack with High Society. With all of the rosters set after the draft itself, and everyone aware of what the general plan was from the competition, it was time to buckle down and wait out the short break before the start of the regular season. Or so, that was the plan. With his first major slip-up of the season, Adifi would begin to cement himself as one of staff's worst mistakes in terms of manager appointments for Season 2. Wait What drafted the vast majority of their friend group, who all happen to be around intermediate range in terms of SR. Unfortunately, there were a few who fell just a bit too high on the scale to qualify, and as a result, couldn't join the team as players. One of the more notable members of this group would be Joe, aka Lethal, a low GM player who is already well known in the community for being extremely toxic. Sure enough, this crew wasn't capable of staying out of trouble for longer than a few minutes at a time, and it was discovered that the 12th round draft pick for Wait What was actually one of Lethal's Smurf accounts. The Smurf was promptly banned, and Adifi as a manager was given a hefty suspension, alongside a harsh warning that any more funny business would lead to his immediate removal from the community as well. There were a few other minor Smurfs found out in intermediate as well, but none of them were quite as organized as this particular attempt. From the very start of the regular season, Overcharge had issues with their main tank spot in particular. Many of the tank players that they had drafted weren't comfortable playing in the current meta after the drastic shift from double shield to brawl, and their issues with toxicity only made it worse. After the first few weeks leading to rough losses at the hands of Powerhouse and Wait What, tensions rose and cooperativeness of the players began to fall. Eventually, most of their drafted tanks would go inactive, causing problems for the majority of the first half of the season. High Society also struggled with certain positions, though theirs was mostly due to them not drafting a real flex DPS. The player they had originally drafted as flex turned out to have filled the player application wrong, and that they were actually another hit scan, of which the team already had an abundance of. In the height of Mei McCree Brawl meta, not having someone who is capable nor willing to play Mei consistently was a serious problem. Unlike Overcharged, High Society still performed rather well despite not having someone to focus on playing the devil herself, but their results were a lot more middling than the team would have liked. Despite pulling off an incredible upset against Powerhouse in Week 2, High Society was struggling with their coaching staff leaving early on in the season. There was supposedly some disagreements between management and the coaches that led to most of them going inactive, leaving only a few like Schaffler to pick up the pieces. The players themselves criticized the coaches to some degree for this, as they would later return for the second half. The middle section of the season was awkwardly void of the amount of coaching they would have liked. Yoink was an interesting case in terms of performance. The team looked coordinated for the most part, but there seemed to be a distinct lack of communication between Luxie the main tank and the rest of the team. Luxie would often charge in aggressively, but the rest of Yoink would still be staging their attack. This meant that Luxie would just end up feeding, and they'd be without their anchor tank for the majority of that fight. While it was funny at times to watch the hyper-aggressiveness happen, it didn't speak well for Yoink's early results. In turn, this would force the lineup to shift around from week to week in an attempt to find the players who would be most ready to dive in alongside Luxie, which hurt their early season even further at times. Though, to Kurt's credit, the players only ever spoke highly of their management, even during this time, so the team as a whole did an incredible job of keeping the spirits up when the going got tough. Powerhouse took an early lead in the standings aside from a brief upset loss against High Society, and didn't look back for a good majority of the first half of the season. They even managed to pull off an upset of their own by toppling the then undefeated Shanghai, making a serious case for themselves to be considered the best team in Inter B. Wait What arguably had one of the easier schedules for the first 3 weeks of the season, which only bolstered their egos and trash talk at first. They took particular pride in sweeping Yoink during Week 1 after they were heavily predicted against by the analysts. By the end of Week 3, just about everyone in the community was ready to see how the new public enemy would stand against the actual top teams in their division, though when it came time they crumbled to Shanghai and Powerhouse without much resistance on the way down. For the time being, they were relegated to a more middling stance in Inter B alongside High Society. Shanghai established themselves as one of the frontrunners immediately after the gates opened and the first few weeks took place. Their scrim schedule was insanely rigorous, and their coaches were determined to make sure that they weren't going to lose a single game throughout the season. The team was forced to drastically shift their strategy for the first couple of weeks after the balance patch hit and Double Shield was no longer viable. A few changes were made to the starting lineup, most notably putting an Aqua over Paladin on the off-tank position. One piece of concern, however, is that only the starters on Shanghai were ever given any real time from the coaching staff. The benched players were forced to merely exist while their teammates soaked in as much playtime as possible. Complaints started to flood in occasionally, which eventually led Little Pants to establishing the D team among the bench, who would focus on non-meta strategies in case the time ever came to beat their enemies with the element of surprise. For a time, this was considered a good environment for Shanghai's bench, though they would run into some more drama later on in the middle part of the season. On top of their issues surrounding the main tank slot, Overcharged had to suffer the loss of one of their star DPS players Primetime early on, after he was discovered to have another account that would have placed him just barely over the range into Advanced instead of Intermediate. Unfortunately, this meant that they had yet another gap to fill in their lineup. However, the team was given an immediate replacement for Primetime, which they used to pick up Romy on main tank. Romy immediately lifted the performance of Overcharged to a new level and gave the team a lot of promise. However, there still was the issue of the older tank line from the draft wanting to play, while still being rather toxic to the rest of the roster. Tensions among these players eventually reached a boiling point, and after another tough loss, they exploded. A lot of arguments broke out internally, which led to the removal of 4 players due to toxicity and other personal problems. A few more pickups were made to replace those that had left, and the team continued on their struggle to claim their first win of the season. A few weeks after a tough loss to High Society, tensions rose yet again. This led to LPN being heavily critical of his teammates, being removed from the team, and Overcharged head coach, at the time Thumper, left as a result. Despite the problem having already been dealt with at that point, this would be one of the many times Overcharged was forced to rebuild their roster and were challenged to come back swinging even harder afterwards. Around the middle section of the regular season, WaitWhat began to struggle with internal issues as well, namely Soundwave having computer troubles which prevented him from being able to play Overwatch. The team started to turn on each other after losing just a few games, and Adifi causing a whole heap of drama after he served his suspension from the smurfing scandal and immediately replaced Emkey for himself on the starting lineup. A good majority of the team thought that Emkey was the better choice to start at that point, but it was incredibly difficult to convince Adifi of that. The back and forth actually got so intense at times that the rest of WaitWhat considered voting Adifi out of his manager position, though that course of action was never truly put into motion. Eventually the drama was settled after Emkey was transferred up to the Hanamura Hotshots in Advanced, allowing Adifi to become the only option for WaitWhat in terms of main supports for a good portion of the remainder of the season. Toward the midpoint in the season, Shanghai had to deal with some more internal issues of their own. Due to the strict coaching regimen, the Sellouts management wasn't particularly willing to put up with anyone on the starting roster underperforming. After a tough loss to Powerhouse and a very close win on Overcharge, they started to experiment with who started. Of course, this disrupted the D team's lineup, which at that point had become rather comfortable playing with each other. Due to some neglect from their management, an us versus them mentality started to form, and many on the bench, especially Little Pants, didn't want to break up what they had been working on for so long. The D team was disbanded, many of those players as well as Little Pants left for other teams, and Shanghai began looking for more players to fill out their bench once again. The second half of the regular season started out just the same as the first half ended for Overcharged, rebuilding a large portion of their roster after a few tough losses. They had gotten ever so close to claiming their first win of the season against teams like Shanghai and High Society in the weeks prior, but they fell just short at the end for both of those matches. Their efforts to solidify their tank line worked wonders, however. The DPS line and support lines were forced into a brief experimental phase before eventually finding their footing. With Romy leading the charge as the latest captain and the new pickups like Razor Sharp, Overcharge were looking better than ever and amped to take on Powerhouse for the second time. They came out of the gate swinging against one of the frontrunners in their division, and in the end, Overcharge managed to topple the Goliaths to steal away their first ever win after a grueling 6-map series. Immediately, the analysts predicted that Overcharge could quickly become one of the top teams so long as they could keep this level of play up they had just showcased for their debut into the second half of the season. High Society, on the other hand, didn't change very much, and were still struggling with what to do with their flex DPS spot. They beat teams considered worse than them, like Yoink at the time, and even managed to upset Powerhouse yet again, but they couldn't quite pull out the magic against the upper teams in Inter B. As soon as he could, Nick signed himself onto the roster to give them an actual flex DPS to work with, and their performance immediately took a much more consistent level. It didn't change their overall match differential, as they still stayed near the middle of the pack, but they made their losses much closer and their wins more dominant. Yoink lost to WaitWhat and Shanghai during the early weeks of the second half. However, now that Little Pants had come over from Shanghai after the whole D-team debacle, as well as their bench player Alligator Andre returning from his inactivity to put his analytical skills to the test, slowly but surely their performance started to get better over the last few weeks of the season. They picked up steam going into the playoffs, and much of this success is contributed to the revamping of their coaching staff. Powerhouse, having lost 2 games in a row at the start of the split, lost a lot of momentum they had built up during the first half. Kef in particular felt incredibly burnt out from the game and decided to retire from the player roster in favor of taking up a coaching position instead, though he wouldn't return as a fully fledged coach until the playoffs got closer. Master Dempsey was also starting to feel burnt out and didn't quite know how to deal with the new hardships they were going through. As a result, he stepped down and let the head coach Stewie step up to the plate in his absence. Stewie was considered a very active coach and a good leader by those on the team that still remained. However, there was still some criticism that he was a large cause of the benched players early on in the season being treated like second-class citizens. However, these players are mostly all gone by this point in the season, so there wasn't much drama left to be had on that front. Shanghai mostly continued on the same path they carved out during the first half, once again losing to Powerhouse in a large upset, this time claiming they had a bad read on the meta as a result of that week's Heroes bans. Otherwise, they dominated every other game they played for that split and landed themselves in the top seed overall going into the postseason. Overcharged had more or less solidified their roster by around week 7 and went on a small hot streak of defeating Powerhouse and Wait What. Unfortunately, their momentum would come crashing to a halt as they faced Yoink in Week 8, who also began a hot streak of their own. It was an incredibly tough match, but Yoink just played better. From there, Overcharged would lose to High Society and Shanghai once again, closing out their season with only 2 wins under their belts. Unfortunate considering the magnitude of those victories and the effect they had on the division at the time. High Society was in danger of losing their spot in the playoffs to Yoink due to the latter's win streak in the last few games of the regular season, and it was mostly up to the Week 9 game between the two to determine whose season would end prematurely. After a thrilling 5-map series, including 1 tie, Yoink proved to have too much momentum and cast High Society down, relegated to watch the playoffs from the sidelines. They did put up a rather dominant stop against Overcharged, but unfortunately Yoink did the same to Powerhouse, so their fate was sealed. Wait What did manage to secure the second place seed in the playoffs for Inter B. However, they weren't quite as dominant as they were going into the second half after losing so dominantly to Powerhouse and Shanghai in the first half. They would claim their revenge on Powerhouse, but Shanghai eluded them yet again. This, combined with a tough loss to Overcharged and a narrow victory over High Society, meant that this team's mentality was already pretty shot going into the playoffs. It wouldn't take very much to send them over the edge, which didn't bode well for their postseason chances. In the end, it was Shanghai, Wait What, Yoink, and Powerhouse that made it into the quarterfinals of the postseason, and were ready to face off against their peers in Inter A. As we had stated in the Inter A season in review, most of Inter B was rather cocky about the best Inter A had to offer, a mistake that many of them would soon learn to regret, as most of their matches ahead of them would end up being much tougher than they had ever expected. To be entirely fair, Yoink just speedran the Papega Parrots. Papega had a slew of internal issues, including tilting, lack of confidence, and internet problems that caused them to simply roll over and die when the time came. So that was basically a free pass into the semifinals for Yoink. Everyone else, on the other hand, would go on to admit that their quarterfinals opponents for Inter A were much tougher than they had given them credit for during the regular season. Shanghai didn't prepare very hard for CDC, and in fact took the week off leading up to the game, assuming they could simply roll their way through the semifinals. While there was a little bit of a grudge match for Vantage to beat his old team, there wasn't enough fuel in the tank to utterly stomp CDC like they had expected. Shanghai did make it out mostly unscathed, only dropping a single map, but the players did admit that they had to try much harder than they were expecting after the fact. Powerhouse by this point in the season were mostly solid. They had set plans and specific maps for where they wanted to swap their tank line around, oftentimes swapping in Grape alongside OO for a surprisingly cohesive strategy. Normally changing something like the tank line up so drastically can end in disaster, but to their credit, Powerhouse did an incredible job of working to everyone's strengths in this case. Unfortunately, that alone wouldn't make up for the fact that they were forced to run double flex DPS as they only had 2 DPS to work with in the first place. Aspect did a good job trying to fill the partial hit scan role, but it definitely led to some issues at times. Double Cap had been struggling with problems of their own, specifically their main tank slot, but despite those shortcomings they brought it to Powerhouse harder than anyone could have ever expected. Powerhouse themselves would go on to say this was the hardest game of the entire season for them, but at the end of it all, they did manage to claim the quarterfinals for their own N5 maps, and move on to the semis to face Shanghai for the third and final time. Wait What was the final team yet to claim their bye into the semifinals from Inter B. However, it was looking like a foregone conclusion. Vitalize had been struggling for weeks leading up to the postseason, and really hadn't put up that much of a fight in the first 2 maps of the series. They made it close in some regard, but everyone, including Vitalize, was fearing that Inter A would be unceremoniously bowing out of the playoffs after just a single round. But as it just so happens, fate had different plans, and those plans came in the form of a Nanoblade. The third map of the series was an absolute nail-biter, as Vitalize clawed out the win tooth and nail. It was still a long climb up that mountain before they could secure their place against Yoink in the semifinals, but the scrappy Inter A underdogs were starting to gain confidence. While no one outside looking in could tell just yet, Wait What had already tilted themselves off the face of the planet after just 3 maps. They weren't particularly in a good mood after their warm-up scrim prior to the quarterfinals, and having to work so hard to secure maps in the early stages of the series took its toll. By the end of Map 2, they started to vocalize their doubts in voice chat, and by Map 3's conclusion, the team silently knew that they would probably lose. Sure enough, if you believe in something hard enough, it just might manifest, and this rang true for both contenders of the quarterfinals game. Vitalize took Wait What the full distance, and by the end, the last vestiges of hope for Inter-A came out on top. Wait What ended their playoff run with a humiliating reverse sweep, with a fair amount of tilting to boot. While they took it easy for the first round of playoffs, Shanghai wasn't messing around anymore. Never before in their history had they beaten Powerhouse, and if they had anything to say about it, the third time would most definitely be the charm. They scrimmed harder than they ever had before and readied themselves to face their bitter rivals. Of course, this was also the first time Powerhouse lacked a dedicated hit scan player, as we discussed a few minutes ago, meaning that Snipes of all people would have a lot more free range throughout the match. And sure enough, that very weakness is the opening these sellouts exploited to steal their ticket to the grand finals. Snipes ran rampant the entire semifinals match, and while Powerhouse did manage to pressure the MVP caliber DPS, it just wasn't enough. For the first time, Powerhouse knew defeat at the hands of Shanghai, losing 3-0 with 1 tie. The other semifinals match was another relative stomp, except not for the side everyone was expecting. Yoink seemed to run out of steam right as Vitalize was riding off the adrenaline high from their reverse sweep the week prior. In hindsight, Yoink had stated that they couldn't get in enough practice to feel comfortable going into the semis, and ultimately fell 3-1. Despite all the odds, approximately half of the playoff contenders Intermediate B put up fell at the hands of the sole survivor of Inter-A. Quite a turn of events, and truly a battle of the best teams in Intermediate as a whole for the main event. For the finals, Shanghai ramped down their scrim schedule compared to the week before. Now having beaten Powerhouse, they felt as though they could return to their normal regiment from the regular season of just scrimming about 5 times a week. While they were practiced and prepared for the Pharah Genji compositions they knew Vitalize liked to run, they also came into the ultimate match of Season 2 with the knowledge that they couldn't show any weakness whatsoever. Vitalize had a habit of harshly punishing their opponents if they took them for granted. Sure enough, just about every single map of the series turned out to be relatively close. Vitalize managed to even take a map off the sellouts, but in the end Shanghai would claim their crown as the Intermediate Division champions with a 4-1 victory. They fought hard all season long, and while there were some concerns and drama surrounding their bench during the early parts of the regular season, they never let that tear them from the inside out. They never allowed their play to be defined by what went on outside of the game itself. In the end, partially because of their tenacity, they were able to hoist the trophy as a result. Intermediate B was an absolute clown fiesta if I've ever seen one. Aside from Shanghai, it never really felt like anyone knew what they were doing for more than a few weeks at a time. I'm honestly more surprised that anyone managed to find success with the insane amount of inconsistencies these teams showed. Like, I totally understand some of the complaints from teams and players that had to deal with this. It's not exactly easy to predict when Overcharge just randomly decides to become the best team in the entire division for 2 weeks before potatoing out for the rest of the season. That being said, I do think a small reality check is in order, because I don't know if it's entirely fair to say that Intermediate A had it so much easier like a lot of Inter B was claiming at the time. Sure, some teams like Shanghai or Overcharged at their peak were absolutely insane, but then I'd argue that the performance floor for Inter B is also significantly lower than anything in Inter A. Like, when teams in Inter B fell on their faces, they practically rolled over and died. Inter A was definitely a lot more stable for the most part, and also relatively average, but you'd have to do some pretty heavy convincing to say that their experience was anything other than different compared to Inter B. With that, however, my hat does go off to everyone that managed to survive their tenure in Intermediate B during Season 2. It was most certainly one hell of an experience, one that I doubt many of us will be capable of forgetting anytime soon. It's about as memorable as a stick of dynamite, and I think that's really the best way to describe this subdivision to people asking what it was like back in the day. The answer? No one knows what the hell just happened. Not even the people doing it.